Tonight is the 20th of September 2010, and this is the 62nd time we are speaking on the Majjhima Nikāya Suttas. Tonight we come to Sutta 148, Chachakka Sutta, the 6 sets of 6. This sutta to me is very important. Might even be the most important sutta in the whole of the Majjhima Nikāya. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was living at Savatthi in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's park. There he addressed the monks thus, "Monks, noble sir," they replied. The Blessed One said, "Monks, I shall teach you the Dhamma that is good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end. With the right meaning and phrasing, I shall reveal a holy life that is utterly perfect and pure. That is, the 6 sets of 6. Listen and attend closely to what I shall say." "Yes, noble sir," the monks replied. The Blessed One said, "The 6 internal bases should be understood. The 6 external bases should be understood. The 6 classes of consciousness should be understood. The 6 classes of contact should be understood. The 6 classes of feeling should be understood. The 6 classes of craving should be understood." Stop here for a moment. You can see the few suttas we have discussed earlier and the following few suttas are all connected with these 6 sense bases. Salayatana. There is a sutta where it is mentioned that Arahants become liberated through contemplating a few very important topics. One of them is the 5 aggregates of attachment. Another one is the 6 sense bases. Another one is the dependent origination. Another one is the 4 elements of the body, 4 great elements. So this 6 sense basis is a very important topic. So that's why the last 2 suttas we have been discussing the 6 sets of this 6 sense basis. The 6 internal bases should be understood. So it was said, and with reference to what was this said, there are the eye base, the ear base, the nose base, the tongue base, the body base, and the mind base. So it was with reference to this that it was said, the 6 internal bases should be understood. This is the first set of 6. The 6 external bases should be understood. So it was said, with reference to what was this said, there are the form base, the sound base, the odor base, the flavor base, the tangible base, and the mind object base. So it was with reference to this that it was said, the 6 external bases should be understood. This is the second set of 6. The 6 classes of consciousness should be understood. So it was said, and with reference to what was this said, dependent on the eye and forms, eye consciousness arises. Dependent on the ear and sounds, ear consciousness arises. Dependent on the nose and odors, nose consciousness arises. Dependent on the tongue and flavors, tongue consciousness arises. Dependent on the body and intangibles, body consciousness arises. Dependent on the mind and mind objects, mind consciousness arises. So it was with reference to this that it was said, the 6 classes of consciousness should be understood. This is the third set of 6. The 6 classes of contact should be understood. So it was said, and with reference to what was this said, dependent on the eye and forms, eye consciousness arises. The meeting of the 3 is contact. Dependent on the ear and sounds, ear consciousness arises. The meeting of the 3 is contact. Dependent on the nose and odors, nose consciousness arises. The meeting of the 3 is contact. Dependent on the tongue and flavors, tongue consciousness arises. The meeting of the 3 is contact. Dependent on the body and tangibles, body consciousness arises. The meeting of the 3 is contact. Dependent on the mind and mind objects, mind consciousness arises. The meeting of the 3 is contact. So it was reference to this that it was said the 6 classes of contact should be understood. This is the 4th set of 6. Stop here for a moment. In the dependent origination, the 12 links of the pendant origination, which analyzes how suffering arises, it is said that because of sankhara, which is basically the will to live, consciousness arises, vijnana. And when consciousness arises, it must always come together with nama rupa. Nama rupa is the mentality, materiality, and basically is phenomenal. What consciousness is conscious of. So when consciousness arises, and there is the object of consciousness, consciousness must arise from somewhere. Consciousness resides in the body, so it arises in the body. And because there are 6 types of consciousness, there are 6 sense bases. So like the eye consciousness or the seeing consciousness arises at the eye base. The hearing consciousness arises at the ear sense base. The smelling consciousness arises at the nose base, etc. So when we look at the first set of 6, the 6 internal bases refers to the 6 sense organs: eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. And the 6 external bases are the external sense objects corresponding to these 6 internal bases. The object of eye is form, the object of ear is sound, object of nose is odor, etc. And then the 6 classes of consciousness is mentioned here. They arise actually one by one, you see. When there is, dependent on eye and forms, eye consciousness arises. So for eye consciousness to arise, a form must come before the eye. Then only, and the eye is a good eye, then only this eye consciousness arises. I mean by a good eye is a working eye, not a blind eye. And when there is a sound, then ear consciousness arises at the ear base. Similarly, when there is a odor, then nose consciousness arises at the nose base, etc. So you can see, for example, here there must be sound for the ear consciousness to arise. But the later books, sometimes there are contradictory teachings. Like in one Mahayana Sutra, it says that this Kuan Yin Bodhisattva, she listens to the sound of the world. In the absence of sound, the absence of sound, she can listen. But the absence of sound, there is no ear consciousness arising. So this is consciousness. Now, once the consciousness arises, the 3 must contact. Dependent on eye and forms, eye consciousness arises. The meeting of the 3 is contact. When there is contact, then there is seeing at the eye. If there's no contact, then there's no seeing. For example, you are deeply absorbed in reading a book, and somebody passes you by. Even though it's in front of you, you should be aware, yet you don't see because your attention is focused on the book. So there must be contact for the seeing to arise. Similarly, when there is ear and sound and ear consciousness, then there must be contact for hearing to arise, etc. The 6 classes of feeling should be understood, so it was said. And with reference to what was this said, dependent on eye and forms, eye consciousness arises. The meeting of the 3 is contact. With contact as condition, there is feeling. Dependent on the ear and sounds, ear consciousness arises. The meeting of the three is contact. With contact as condition, there is feeling. Dependent on the nose and odors, nose consciousness arises. The meeting of the three is contact. With contact as condition, there is feeling. Dependent on the tongue and flavors, tongue consciousness arises. The meeting of the three is contact. With contact as condition, there is feeling. Dependent on the body and tangibles, body consciousness arises. The meeting of the three is contact. With contact as condition, there is feeling. Dependent on the mind and mind objects, mind consciousness arises. The meeting of the three is contact. With contact as condition, there is feeling. So it was with reference to this that it was said, the 6 classes of feeling should be understood. This is the 5th set of 6. The 6 classes of craving should be understood. So it was said. With reference to what was this said? Dependent on eye and forms, eye consciousness arises. The meeting of the three is contact. With contact as condition, there is feeling. With feeling as condition, there is craving. Similarly, dependent on the ear and sounds, ear consciousness arises, etc. With feeling as condition, there is craving. Dependent on the nose and odors, nose consciousness arises, etc. With feeling as condition, there is craving. Dependent on the tongue and flavors, tongue consciousness arises, etc. With feeling as condition, there is craving. Dependent on the body and tangibles, body consciousness arises, etc. With feeling as condition, there is craving. Dependent on the mind and mind objects, mind consciousness arises. The meeting of the three is contact. With contact as condition, there is feeling. With feeling as condition, there is craving. So it was with reference to this that it was said, the 6 classes of craving should be understood. This is the 6th set of 6. Stop here for a moment. So, when there is contact between these eye and forms and eye consciousness, then seeing arises. Once there is seeing, the person pays attention to the form, sees the form, then a feeling arises. Whether it's a pleasant feeling or unpleasant feeling or neutral feeling, neither painful nor pleasant. Similarly for the ear base and nose base, etc. Now when the feeling arises is a pleasant feeling, then craving arises. For example, the eye base. This eye consciousness arises and there is contact, then there is seeing, and once there is seeing, there is feeling. If the feeling happens to be a pleasant feeling, then there is craving for it, craving for the object, the form. Similarly, when ear consciousness arises and there is contact, then a feeling arises. Then if it's a pleasant feeling, then there is craving to hear more of the beautiful sound. Similarly, to craving for smells, craving for taste, craving for touch, and craving for thoughts. So, these 6 classes of craving. Now we come to this important part, demonstration of not self. If anyone says the I is self, that is not attainable. The rise and fall of the I are discerned, and since its rise and fall are discerned, it would follow myself rises and falls. That is why it is not attainable for anyone to say the I is self. Thus the I is not self. If anyone says forms are self, in the same way, that is not attainable. The rise and fall of forms are discerned, are seen. Thus the I is not self, forms are not self. If anyone says I consciousness is self, that is not attainable. The rise and fall of I consciousness are discerned. And since, etc., that is why it is not attainable for anyone to say I consciousness is self. Thus the I is not self, forms are not self, I consciousness is not self. If anyone says I contact is self, that is not attainable. The rise and fall of eye contact are discerned, etc. That is why it is not attainable for anyone to say, eye contact is self. Thus the I is not self, forms are not self, I consciousness is not self, eye contact is not self. If anyone says feeling is self, that is not attainable. The rise and fall of feeling are discerned, etc. That is why it is not attainable for anyone to say feeling is self. Thus the I is not self, forms are not self, I, consciousness is not self, I, contact is not self, feeling is not self. If anyone says craving is self, that is not attainable. The rise and fall of craving are discerned, etc. That is why it is not attainable for anyone to say craving is self. Thus the I is not self, forms are not self, I, consciousness is not self, I, contact is not self, feeling is not self, craving is not self. Stop here for a moment. So here you see, as far as the I base is concerned, all those 6 things mentioned are said to be not self, because the rise and fall of each one is seen, namely I, forms, I consciousness, I contact, feeling, craving, these 6. Now for the second base, the same thing is repeated. If anyone says the ear is self, that is not attainable. The rise and fall of the ear are discerned, and since its rise and fall are discerned, it would follow myself rises and falls. That is why it is not attainable for anyone to say the ear is self, thus the ear is not self. Similarly, if anyone says sounds are self, ear consciousness is self, ear contact is self, feeling is self, craving is self, that is not attainable, because the rise and fall of all these are discerned. That is why it is not attainable for anyone to say craving is self. As the ear is not self, sounds are not self, ear consciousness is not self, ear contact is not self, feeling is not self, craving is not self. Then we come to the third base. If anyone says the nose is self, that is not attainable. The rise and fall of the nose are discerned, and since its rise and fall are discerned, it would follow myself rises and falls. That is why it is not attainable for anyone to say the nose is self, thus the nose is not self. Similarly, if anyone says odors are self, nose consciousness is self, nose contact is self, feeling is self, craving is self, that is not attainable, because the rise and fall of all these are discerned or seen. That is why it is not attainable for anyone to say all these are self. Thus the nose is not self, odors are not self, nose consciousness is not self, nose contact is not self, feeling is not self, craving is not self. Now we come to the tongue. If anyone says the tongue is self, that is not attainable. The rise and fall of the tongue are discerned, and since its rise and fall are discerned, it would follow myself rises and falls. That is why it is not attainable for anyone to say the tongue is self, thus the tongue is not self. If anyone says flavors are self, tongue consciousness is self, tongue contact is self, feeling is self, craving is self, that is not attainable, because the rise and fall of all these are discerned or seen. Thus the tongue is not self, flavors are not self, tongue consciousness is not self, tongue contact is not self, feeling is not self, craving is not self. Now we come to the body. If anyone says the body is self, that is not attainable. The rise and fall of the body are discerned, and since its rise and fall are discerned, it would follow myself rises and falls. That is why it is not attainable for anyone to say the body is self. Thus the body is not self. If anyone says tangibles are self, body consciousness is self, body contact is self, feeling is self, craving is self, that is not attainable, because the rise and fall of all these are discerned or seen. Thus the body is not self, tangibles are not self, body consciousness is not self, body contact is not self, feeling is not self, craving is not self. If anyone says the mind is self, that is not attainable. The rise and fall of the mind are discerned, and since its rise and fall are discerned, it would follow myself rises and falls. That is why it is not attainable for anyone to say the mind is self. Thus the mind is not self. If anyone says mind objects are self, mind consciousness is self, mind contact is self, feeling is self, craving is self, that is not attainable, because the rise and fall of all these are discerned. Thus the mind is not self, mind objects are not self, mind consciousness is not self, mind contact is not self, feeling is not self, craving is not self. Stop for a moment. So here you see the whole 6 sense basis, the Buddha says, All these are concerned with the six sense bases is not self. The six sense bases are not self. The six sense objects are not self. The six consciousness are not self. The contexts are not self. The feelings that arise are not self. The craving that arise are not self. So this covers practically everything in the world, because there's a sutta where the Buddha says all are in the six sense basis. Everything in the world is in consciousness, and because everything in the world is in consciousness, so it is in the six sense basis. You consider, for example, the body. The body is already covered here by the fifth sense base. The mind is also covered by the sixth sense base. Objects are also covered. Objects are objects, sound, smell, taste, everything. So the mental as well as the physical aspect of everything in the world is covered here. And basically, the Buddha is saying that you cannot find any self in the world. So here, you look carefully, it says the argument why he says there is no self. He says, the rise and fall of each one are discerned. And since the rise and fall are discerned, it would follow myself rises and falls. So because it says myself rises and falls, that is not acceptable. That's why he says this self. There is no self in everything in the world. This here, the rise and fall is another way of saying the I is impermanent. You see in other suttas, like the last night we read, the Buddha asks, is the I permanent or impermanent? And then the answer is, the I is impermanent. Is what is impermanent suffering or happiness? Suffering, Venerable Sir. Is what is impermanent suffering and subject to change, fit to be regarded as this is mine, this I am, this is myself? And then it says no, Venerable Sir. So in that sutta, it's talking about the term impermanent. Here, instead of saying impermanent, it says the rise and fall, basically the same thing. So what is this rise and fall? Another way of saying rise and fall is origination and cessation. Something is born. You can also say birth and death. Something comes into being and ceases. But I find, after thinking about it, the most appropriate word here is appearance and disappearance. Everything in the world appears and disappears. So, because it appears and disappears, that's why it says, if you take anything in the world to be the self, then myself appears and disappears. How can myself appear suddenly and disappear suddenly? So it cannot be the self. So, just like when we see a movie, it's so real. When you are absorbed in the movie, a lot of people, sentimental people, when the actress cries, you cry. When the actor is angry, you get angry. It's so real to you. But at the end of the show, then you realize, oh, it's only a show. And what is very similar to life, actually, is dream. When we are dreaming, it seems so real to us, and you can see yourself in the dream just like now. And then in the morning when you wake up, then you realize it was a dream. And you think all that excitement, all that worry, actually no point to have been frightened, no point to have worried so much. It was only a dream. Why do you say it was a dream? When you were in the dream, you didn't realize it was a dream. But when it ended only, then only you realize it's a dream, right? So right now, life is like a dream. When our life comes to an end, at the end of, say, now average 75 years, when it comes to an end, If you have seen how people die, a lot of people, the next place of rebirth, a few days before they pass away, will surface. They start to see another world, and depending on their reaction, you can tell whether they are going to a happy destination of rebirth or a woeful destination of rebirth. So it's like a new dream starting. Their mind changes channel. It's like you change your TV channel. The consciousness is changing to another channel. And this channel, this life is starting to fade away. So only at that point, when this dream ends, then only you realize it's a dream. As long as it does not end, you don't realize it's a dream. Suppose your dream at night was prolonged. As long as the dream keeps going, you don't realize it's a dream, right? It's only when it ends, then you realize it's a dream. Why? Because the rise and fall, the origination and cessation, the birth and death, the appearance and disappearance of the dream is very apparent to you. When the dream ends, then all that remains is a memory of the dream. Nothing left whatsoever. Everything that seemed so real in the dream suddenly disappeared. Not even a trace of it is left behind. The only thing left behind is the memory. So the fact that it stopped, so then you realize it appeared suddenly, and when the dream ended, maybe after 1 hour, and then it disappeared entirely. So you think it's like it never existed. It's only a trick of the mind, a play of the mind. So when we consider life is a longer dream, in terms of, say, like instead of 75 minutes, maybe it's 75 years. But you think of it like the previous life. The previous life, when we were living in the previous life, it must have been as real as now. But now that the previous life has ended, it's just like a dream. Nothing left of the previous life. It's worse than the dream. We don't even remember the previous life. Not only did it totally faded away, even the memory of it also faded away. So that's why life is so much like a dream. Only when it ends, then we realize that it was just a play of the mind. That's why in Hinduism they call it Maya, illusion, a play of the mind. In the Majjhima Nikāya Sutta 75, I think Magandhya Sutta, the Buddha said that we have long been tricked by the mind, long been deceived by the mind. We have been believing the mind all the time. And then in the Samyutta Nikāya, I think the 22nd chapter, the Buddha says, consciousness is a conjurer, like a magician, conjures up a show for us. One show, one lifetime is one show. One lifetime we see ourselves as a human being. Another lifetime we see ourselves as a deva or devi. Another lifetime we see ourselves as a ghost or something. So that's why consciousness creates this show of life. That's why the Buddha says that consciousness is a conjurer. So for most people, we think that this dream of life lasts 75 years. If our life is 75 years, we think this dream lasts 75 years. But if you look carefully in the suttas, it is even shorter than the dream you have at night. The dream you have at night may last 75 minutes. But you look at this paragraph 6. Dependent on the eye and forms, eye consciousness arises. Dependent on the ear and sounds, ear consciousness arises. Dependent on the nose and odors, nose consciousness arises. Dependent on the tongue and flavors, tongue consciousness arises. Dependent on the body and tangibles, body consciousness arises. Dependent on the mind and mind objects, mind consciousness arises. So these 6 consciousness arise one by one, dependent on conditions. And they arise just a very short while and they cease. And it has to have this condition for some object, external sense object, for example, a sound, to come before your ear consciousness will arise again. And then it will cease. And then another consciousness arise and cease. Another consciousness arise and cease. Every time the consciousness arises, there is the world, right? We are alive. When the consciousness ceases, the world has disappeared. Because the world is only in consciousness. Right? So this dream is shorter than your 75 minutes dream at night. It only lasts what the Buddha calls one kana, one conscious moment, arises and passes away. And if you look into dependent origination, this vijnana arises because of sankhara. Sankhara, I mentioned, is the will to live. So when our consciousness arises due to conditions, it cannot sustain, it will cease. And when it ceases, because of our strong will to live, it arises again. We want to live long, but we cannot live long. One conscious moment, we die again. And then because of the will again, the consciousness projects. And it cannot last, it will die. That's why in the suttas, the Buddha says, the Arahants say, there is no living being. It seems like there is a living being, but there is no living being because this consciousness cannot sustain. We are only trying to live moment to moment. We are trying to exist, but we cannot exist continually. For most people, we think that consciousness is an unending stream of consciousness. We are conscious all the time, but not according to the Buddha's words. In the Buddha's teachings, we are not conscious all the time. We are conscious for a short while, and this consciousness ceases. And then it takes a strong willpower, the will to live, for the consciousness to project up again. And then it cannot sustain, it will die again. So moment to moment, we are dying. That's why one Christian saint said that every moment I die. So you can see here that this dream of life only lasts for one conscious moment. And these conscious moments, it seems, are so short that in 1 second, there are many, many conscious moments. I don't know how many, I don't know, thousands or millions or one. But this conscious moment is extremely short time. So our dream of life is so short moment only, it ends. And then it takes will to live, and it comes into this consciousness comes into being for a short while, and it passes away. So because this rise and fall is there of consciousness, the Buddha says there is no self. If there is a self, it must exist all the time, because the definition of self, atta, is something that exists permanently. Because if it exists permanently, you can identify this is me. But if it just arises for a short while and disappears, where did that self go? That's why this sutta is so important. Makes us see everything in the world, because it appears and disappears, that actually nothing we can say is I or mine. So this appearance and disappearance, because it's so fast, our mind is deluded into thinking that it's a continuous stream. Just like last time, those neon lights, you have one bulb, and this bulb lights up and stops. The other bulb lights up and stops, and this light bulb. So you see, as though there's a continuous line. The light goes continuously, running continuously, but it's not running continuously. It just arises and passes away. There's no line. But our mind is, our vision is tricked into seeing there's a running light. These lights are running, but they are not running. It's just a deception. So similarly, consciousness is playing tricks on us and making us think that life is real. But life is not real. It just exists for a momentary moment, kana, conscious moment, and ends. That's why nothing in the world, nothing in the mind or outside the mind Nothing in the body or outside the body can be said to be the self. Okay, now we come to paragraph 16. Now monks, this is the way leading to the origination of identity. This word translated here as personality, the Pali is Nikāya. And I think Rebel Thanissaro came up with this very apt translation, identity. This identity means we identify ourselves with, here is talking about I, forms and all that. So because we identify ourselves with something in the world, basically this body and this mind, so there is this identity view that I exist. This is the way leading to the origination of identity. One regards the I thus, this is mine, this I am, this is myself. Similarly, one regards form thus, this is mine, this I am, this is myself. One regards I consciousness, I contact, feeling, craving thus, this is mine, this I am, this is myself. Similarly, one regards the ear thus, this is mine, this I am, this is myself. Etc. One regards the nose thus, this is mine, this I am, this is myself, etc. One regards the tongue thus, this is mine, this I am, this is myself, etc. One regards the body thus, this is mine, this I am, this is myself, etc. One regards the mind thus, this is mine, this I am, this is myself. One regards mind objects thus, one regards mind consciousness thus, one regards mind contact thus, one regards feeling thus, one regards craving thus, this is mine, this I am, this is myself. I'll stop here for a moment. In some other suttas, when the Buddha talks about identity, Nikāya, the Buddha talks about the five aggregates. We identify ourselves with the body, feeling, perception, volition and consciousness, the five aggregates, which are basically body and mind. But here, it is in terms of the six sense bases. It's a bit different. Now monks, this is the way leading to the cessation of identity. One regards the I thus, this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. One regards forms thus, similarly, one regards I consciousness thus, one regards I contact thus, one regards feeling thus, one regards craving thus. This is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. Similarly, for the other sense basis, one regards the ear thus, this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself, etc. One regards the nose thus, this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself, etc. One regards the tongue thus, this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself, etc. One regards the body thus, this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself, etc. One regards the mind thus, this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. One regards mind object, one regards mind consciousness, one regards mind contact, one regards feeling, one regards craving thus, this is not mine, this is I am not, this is not myself. This identity means we identify ourselves with this here, the six sense bases and the objects and the feeling, craving, etc. And this identity is one of the factors that prevent us from liberation. So when a person attains Sotapanna, then he can see that the body and the mind is not self, because they are impermanent, as just now mentioned, they appear and disappear. Normally, most of us, we are very attached to our feelings. We crave for pleasant feelings, and we are very fearful of painful feelings. But feelings are one of the things that appears and disappears very fast. But then we don't see it. That's why we identify ourselves also with feelings. Monks, dependent on the I and forms, I consciousness arises. The meeting of the three is contact. With contact as condition, there arises a feeling felt as pleasant or painful, or neither painful nor pleasant. When one is touched by a pleasant feeling, if one delights in it, welcomes it, and remains holding to it, then the underlying tendency to lust lies within one. If one is touched by a painful feeling, if one sorrows, grieves and laments, weeps beating one's breast and becomes distraught, then the underlying tendency to aversion lies within one. If one is touched by a neither painful nor pleasant feeling, if one does not understand as it actually is the origination, disappearance, gratification, danger and escape in regard to that feeling, then the underlying tendency to ignorance lies within one. Monks, that one shall here and now make an end of suffering without abandoning the underlying tendency to lust for pleasant feeling, without abolishing the underlying tendency to aversion towards painful feeling, without extirpating the underlying tendency to ignorance in regard to neither painful nor pleasant feeling, without abandoning ignorance and arousing true knowledge, this is impossible. Monks, dependent on the ear and sounds, ear consciousness arises, etc. Dependent on the mind and mind objects, it skips all the other bases. Mind consciousness arises. The meeting of the three is contact. With contact as condition, there arises a feeling felt as pleasant or painful, or neither painful nor pleasant, etc. Monks, that one should here and now make an end of suffering without abandoning the underlying tendency to lust for pleasant feeling, without abandoning ignorance and arousing true knowledge, this is impossible. Stop here for a moment. So here, it's very clear when this pleasant feeling arises, there is normally underlying tendency to lust for it. And when painful feeling arises, as I mentioned just now, there is an underlying tendency to aversion, revulsion towards it. But when neither painful nor pleasant feeling arises, because it's a neutral feeling, it doesn't stir our emotions, so there is the underlying tendency to ignorance to it. So the Buddha here says, without abandoning the underlying tendency to lust for pleasant feeling, without abolishing the underlying tendency to aversion towards painful feeling, without extirpating the underlying tendency to ignorance, in regard to neither painful nor pleasant feeling, and without abandoning ignorance and arousing true knowledge, this is impossible. But then, unless we have cultivated our mind to have a developed mind, it is not easy to abandon the tendency to lust for pleasant feeling, or the tendency to aversion towards painful feeling. It's not easy. So we have to cultivate our mind. Then only we have a chance of abolishing those tendencies. Monks, dependent on the I and forms, I consciousness arises. The meeting of the three is contact. With contact as condition, there arises a feeling felt as pleasant or painful, or neither painful nor pleasant. When one is touched by a pleasant feeling, if one does not delight in it, welcome it, and remain holding to it, then the underlying tendency to lust does not lie within one. If one is touched by a painful feeling, if one does not sorrow, grieve, and lament, does not weep, beating one's breast and become distraught, then the underlying tendency to aversion does not lie within one. If one is touched by a neither painful nor pleasant feeling, if one understands as it actually is the origination, disappearance, gratification, danger and escape in regard to that feeling, then the underlying tendency to ignorance does not lie within one. Monks, that one shall here and now make an end of suffering by abandoning the underlying tendency to lust for pleasant feeling, by abolishing the underlying tendency to aversion towards painful feeling, by extirpating the underlying tendency to ignorance in regard to neither painful nor pleasant feeling, by abandoning ignorance and arousing true knowledge, this is possible. Monks, dependent on the ear and sounds, ear consciousness arises, etc. Dependent on the mind and mind objects, mind consciousness arises. The meeting of the three is contact. With contact as condition, there arises a feeling felt as pleasant or painful, or neither painful nor pleasant, etc. Monks, that one shall here and now make an end of suffering by abandoning the underlying tendency to lust for pleasant feeling, etc., by abandoning ignorance and arousing true knowledge. This is possible. So here, the Buddha is saying that only when one is unmoved by pleasant feeling or unpleasant feeling, and one understands the neither painful nor pleasant feeling, the origination, disappearance, etc. And then and one can abandon ignorance and arouse true knowledge. Only this will enable us to attain liberation. As I mentioned before, we have to cultivate our mind before we can be unmoved by pleasant and unpleasant feelings, etc. Seeing thus monks, a well-taught noble disciple becomes disenchanted with the eye, disenchanted with forms, disenchanted with eye consciousness, disenchanted with eye contact, disenchanted with feeling, disenchanted with craving. Similarly, he becomes disenchanted with the ear, with the nose, with the tongue, with the body, with the mind. Disenchanted with the external sense objects, disenchanted with the sense consciousness, disenchanted with the contact, disenchanted with the feeling that arises, disenchanted with the craving. Being disenchanted, he becomes dispassionate. Through dispassion, his mind is liberated. When it is liberated, there comes the knowledge. It is liberated. He understands birth is destroyed. The holy life has been lived. What had to be done has been done. There is no more coming to any state of being. That is what the Blessed One said. The monks were satisfied and delighted in the Blessed One's words. Now, while this discourse was being spoken, through not clinging, the minds of 60 monks were liberated from the taints. That means they attained arahanthood. That's the end of the sutta. So here you see this paragraph 40. Seeing thus, a well-taught noble disciple becomes disenchanted with the eye, with forms, etc. So if we can see that everything in the world appears and disappears just like a dream, then we become disenchanted with everything in the world. If we really think about it, we think, for example, our childhood. Not so long ago, we were a small boy or a small girl. And then all that passed by just like a dream. All that remains is just your memory of your past. And if it's too long, like the previous life, even the memory also is lost. So at the end of this life, everything that seems so important in this world will all disappear entirely. That's why in some suttas the Buddha says at the moment of dying, everything will become cool. So don't take things don't be too attached to things in the world, because very soon we are going to leave everything behind, sooner than we realize. And at the end of our life, we will see that everything in the world actually is not important at all, just like a dream, just pass away. Only when we are in the dream, it seems so important, just like at night when we dream. When inside the dream, everything is so important. When it ends, then we realize nothing is important. So what is important is only where we are going to take rebirth, where we are going for another dream. So if you understand the Dhamma, then we are not so attached. And if we are not so attached, we don't suffer so much. I think tonight I have no time to complete another sutta that I wanted. It's already 49 minutes. I think this is a very interesting sutta, I think, to discuss. This is one of the profound suttas that to really understand, we have got to have a clearer mind. When we have a clearer mind, we are rid of the 5 hindrances, then we can understand more. You can see, like the Buddha spoke this discourse, those monks who had attained 4 jhanas, and they listened to this, 60 of them became arahants. It is discourses like this which are very important. Not like some people say the Satipatthana Sutta is the most important discourse. I don't see any monk listen to the Satipatthana Sutta and became arahant. Suttas like this, where the Buddha explains no self so clearly. If your mind is clear enough, you listen to suttas like this, then you will attain the various stages of Aryahood. If you were to think about this on your own, you can never understand it so well. like what the Buddha described here. That's why suttas are so helpful for us to attain wisdom and attain liberation. Because the Buddha's words are pure words of wisdom. We just need to understand it. But whether we understand it or not depends on our state of mind. Only when you have a clear mind, rid of the five hindrances, then only you can understand. Okay, anything to discuss? It is dependent origination, but not the standard 12 links of dependent origination. Yeah, of course it's important to understand. Mm. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Feeling. I feel. I cut off the craving. Yeah. 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 Oh, those people who became arahant, it's not due to seeing this identity, Sakaya, but in seeing that paragraph 10, that no self. It's a paragraph 10 to 15. When they see this, then they become liberated. The paragraph 16 to 21, when they see that, then they become stream enterer only. So this type of sutta, if you be good, if you all read it again and again and again, try to understand. At the same time, of course, you have to meditate, clear the mind of all the sloth and torpor and doubt and restlessness, etc. Then only you can see more clearly. The five hindrances are dropped when you are about to attain the first jhana. Just before entering the first jhana, what is called the threshold concentration by later books, or assess concentration. Then the five hindrances drop away. Oh. When you attain the first jhana, then the 5 hindrances drop away quite permanently. So, But if you have attained the first jhana, it's no more hindrance. There are various degrees of this sloth and torpor. When it's strong, it is a hindrance. If it's not strong, it's not a hindrance. No doubt, you can see, is doubt about the Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha. When you understand the Dhamma, then you have no more doubt about Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha. It's not about doubt about worldly things, No. There are, last year when we did the Samyutta Nikāya, it was mentioned there about this neither painful nor pleasant feeling. There is I think there is a type that is worldly, there's type that is spiritual. Similarly with delight, piti, there's a type that is worldly. When you enjoy worldly pleasures, there is a type of piti, there's a type of delight that is worldly, and then there's a type that is spiritual. The spiritual one refers to the first jhana. So I guess this one, this neutral feeling is also in regard to when you indulge in worldly, when you are sort of your attention is directed towards worldly things. There is a type of neutral feeling. For example, you see a certain form. It's not especially beautiful or it's not especially ugly. So you just have a neutral feeling towards it. Or you hear a sound. It's not a beautiful classical music, and neither is it a unpleasant sound or somebody scolding you. So it's just a neutral feeling arises. But there's another type that is spiritual. I don't remember the definition, but you look into the Samyutta Nikāya, it's there. I think under feelings. Okay, can we end here?